So we have to stand there to take the Assad regime out, and the ISIS will go out directly.
And there's something called the Joint Combined Planning Cell, which is based in Riyadh. This was approved by President Obama, where you have U.S. military personnel meeting on a daily basis with Saudi military leadership, helping to coordinate this war. And so.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. So the haters who totally screwed up the Middle East now want us to go after the Muslims. They want to fight ISIS by keeping out all the people running away from ISIS. Meanwhile, the Germans are welcoming 1 million refugees into their country. When the gaggle of governors said they would keep refugees out of their states, Connecticut's Governor Malloy bucked the tide and said he'd welcome refugees. Some Connecticut residents called for a rally against refugees, and they were able to gather together a couple dozen people outside Hartford's Capitol building. But counter-demonstrators in the hundreds turned out on the other side of the building, and they listened to a number of speakers, including yours truly. The talks they gave will be featured on the show today, along with some terrible views of Yemen, a country destroyed by the Saudis and President Obama.
I'm absolutely proud to look over and see all these beautiful faces. This is a true coalition. When we say the people get together here to welcome the Syrian people, this is what we mean. We mean the old people and the young people. We mean the white and the black and the brown and the yellow. We mean the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, those who have a faith and those who do not have faith. This is the face of America that has to open its doors, and is opening its doors and welcoming our Syrian brothers and sisters. Let me remind the other opposition. Read history. It will do you quite a good thing. The Syrian people have been known throughout history that their door has never closed on a refugee in the region. They did not discriminate between the Arabs and the non-Arabs. They did not discriminate based on religion. Anyone who is fleeing a war-torn place or is seeking shelter has found peace and has found the doors of Syria open throughout history. Let me remind the other side also that there are in this conflict, there are some facts and there are some fictions. There is some ignorance and there is some knowledge. And what we need to do is we need to decipher among all of this. In this crisis, there is different groups, and I have a very short message to each and every one. Let me start with you, who stand with the Syrian people. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for braving this cold and rainy day to be here and to let your voice be heard. However, we need to do our work. We need to do and start a conversation between ourselves, because the Syrian crisis is not a refugee crisis. There is a bigger problem that we have to address. But here, today, we come united with one message and say, welcome to the Syrian people. But what we need to do is we need to sit down around a table and say, how can we fix this problem? How can we keep the Syrian people safe in their homes? We might differ on the approach, but at least there are some things that we have to realize. I am from Tunisia and I know the region. The region suffered from colonialism, suffered from intervention, suffered from wars that were imposed on it. But we must also recognize that the region suffered from its own dictatorship that killed its own people, that prevented its own people from being free and dignified. We must recognize that. Bashar al-Assad is a dictator who killed his own people. But also Bashar al-Assad, there is forces from outside who try to impose and intervene in the Syrian crisis. Instead of helping Syrians to solve their own problems, we created even a bigger mess. We created a bigger mess. And we, as people who support Syrians, we must help them find a solution. We must help the Syrian people find a solution, not through war, not through military intervention, and not through proxy and financing extreme groups.
So, here's the thing. When they ask the lawyers to speak, one of our jobs is to talk about the law. And I'm going to try not to put you to sleep. But I think it's something that's worth talking about here. Because, you know, we heard an explanation over the last couple of weeks. We have heard an explanation for the state's positions refusing refugees that isn't necessarily on the face of it easily apprehended as being racist or bigoted or xenophobic. But when you know the history and when you know the legal implications of the terminology, it reverberates. Somewhere in the back of your mind you start thinking about this connection. Because what's that explanation? What's the explanation that isn't, oh no, we can't have Syrians or Muslims living in our state? The explanation is, well, we have the right to make that decision in our state, to keep people out. Sound familiar? This is states' rights. Now, that's what I want to talk about for a couple of minutes, states' rights. Now, where did the states' rights movement originate? Well, you know, if you know your American history, you know that the original states' right was the right of slave owners to secede from the United States and form a nation based on slavery. That's right. That was the original states' rights. After they were defeated and Reconstruction was going on, and African Americans, former slaves, were being given the right to vote and own land and own property. Once again, states' rights. States' rights meant the right to organize the Ku Klux Klan in your state. It meant the right to hang black people. It meant the right to lynch. It meant the right to burn. It meant the right to castrate. It meant the right to hire people as sharecroppers. It meant the right to exploit. That's what states' rights meant, and that's where it comes from. That's right. And we know that's where it comes from because we know in the 1930s, when the entire nation was in a Great Depression, there was a discussion in Congress about something called the minimum wage. Where did the opposition to the minimum wage come from and why? It came from the southern states who said, states' rights. We don't want to have to pay black people the same as white people. That's what they said. In the halls of Congress, on the floor of the Senate, they said, we do not want to have to pay black people the same as we pay white people. That's what states' rights is. The 1950s and 1960s, the great uprising, the great civil rights movement in this country, states' rights was right front and center. States' rights said, that little girl doesn't have the right to go to the school that my kids go to because she's black. States' rights said, I have the right to have a separate but equal bathroom in a public place, which we know was not separate. It was certainly separate, but it was certainly not equal. States' rights meant the right to separate but equal schools and universities and lunch counters and hotels and train cars and buses. It meant being able to segregate between black people and white people. That's what states' rights meant. Let's move forward a little bit more. You know, a lot of that same racism is still there. We're seeing it today. We saw it in South Carolina, where a white gunman walked into a church in the middle of a prayer session, shot the place up, killed a bunch of folks. What happened? The police took him to Burger King. Before they took him to the station to book him, they took an armed terrorist and said, hey, let us get you a Whopper. That's states' rights. That's the notion that somehow state sovereignty means that it's okay to be racist and it's okay to disobey the laws of the land. But it's not just white and black. Within the last few years, we've also seen a discussion about states' rights. States' rights supposedly means that it doesn't matter that the Supreme Court says that the law of the land is that any two people are allowed to be married to each other. That same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples have the same rights to be married. And the states' rights activists once again said, oh no, we want to have the right in our state to say no, to not issue marriage licenses, to not allow people to be married even though the Supreme Court says you can be married. And now, yet another lie. States' rights says you have the right to defy federal immigration policy. People who are here lawfully in the United States can be told, no, you cannot come to our state. That's the legacy of states' rights. When Donald Trump stands up and spews his hate, it's not a vacuum. It's not something happening in a vacuum. It's not because he's just a bad person. It's a legacy of hundreds of years of states' rights rhetoric based on the idea of segregation, exclusion, bigotry, and xenophobia. And that's what we're here to stand up against, because we're not going to take it. I look out in this audience. This audience isn't just white people. It's not just straight people. It's not just binary people. It's not just people who were born here. It's not just people whose first language is English. And it certainly as hell is not just people who grew up in the state of Connecticut. The notion that somehow this state has the ability, any state has the ability to say, oh no, we're going to decide who can be here and who can't. It's nonsense. But that's the legacy that Trump has been seizing on and using and whipping up his hatred around. Now, several of the speakers have talked about how important it is for us to talk about facts. At this point, I suspect an awful lot of folks here already know this, but I just want to emphasize this point because it is part of the legal discussion that's been taking place. And I want you to think about the legal issue, but I also want you to think about the implications, the political issue. These governors announced that they would not allow Syrian refugees in their states. And you may very well have heard that because we have federal immigration policy, the states don't have the authority to say no. And that's true. And that's the legal fact. But now let's think about the political implications of that fact. Because that means that when the governor of a state stands up and announces that his state will not allow refugees, he knows that he's telling a lie. He knows that he is telling his constituents something that is simply not true. He knows he has no ability to enforce it. So then you have to ask yourself, well, if a governor knows, or a senator or a congressman, if they know that this is not possible and it's not legal and that no court in the land would uphold it, why do they say it? Why do they pretend that it's true? And there is only one reason, because their goal is to whip up as much bigotry, racism, xenophobia, and hatred as they possibly can. That's their agenda.
We've come here today to counter the Islamophobia that the people on the other side of this building would see run the people's conscience of this country. But we've also come here today to show that we are not afraid, that we are not letting fear-mongering about safety plant seeds of doubt in our minds when it is refugees that are facing the most unsafe conditions. But here's a great counter-argument to people who feel that we need to take care of our own first before we let refugees in, or we need to solve our own problems first. It could be that one of these refugees actually has a solution to take care of these problems, or a way to take care of your own. Not that the funds or the housing don't already exist. It's literally a matter of taking some time to realize where these funds are going versus where they could actually be going. That's right. The United States spends 50% of its budget on funding its imperialist war machine, while the other 50% is split up variously on other expenditures. It's true that the United States government doesn't take care of its own veterans, as many detractors point out, but caring for veterans, refugees, and all others in need are not mutually exclusive. The money is there, but the priorities are not. But here, you are here today.
First of all, what's happening in Syria, it's a start as a revolution against the Assad regime, the dictatorship who started to control the country since 52 years, from his father to the son. People, they stand for that, and they start to make some change. But the Assad regime doesn't hesitate to start killing us back. More than 2 million houses have been bombed in the past 4 years. 2 million houses, 2 million families with no house inside Syria. There where the problem of the refugees start to come up on the surface. When we start losing our houses, we need other place safe for our children, for our kids, for our parents to be in safe. So it's a start from there. Now, today, what's our duty to the? Excuse my broken English. Actually, I'm sorry. Try to understand me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. What we have to do today is two things. On political field, we have to fight to take this regime who brought ISIS and all these terrorist groups there in Syria to save his back and to show himself to the world like either me or this terrorist group. So we have to stand there to take the Assad regime out, and the ISIS will go out directly. Because ISIS has no place in Syria. Syria is where all the civilizations start. All the religions start there. It's our history. It's our place for everyone. So we have to stand as in the political landscape to take the Assad regime out. He can't stay there anymore. Second thing, which is very important today, every year we get surprised by the winter. And we start hear about people who are dying from cold because they have no any source of heat. There is no power, no electric, nothing. They are in shelter. There's even no shelter. They are in tents in the valley, in the mountain, and everywhere. And they are getting died because it's cold. So today, it's our duty to do whatever we can to help these people.
The other day, Mike Rawlings, the mayor of Dallas, nailed it. He was asked about the possibilities that refugees might be terrorists. He answered, "I am more fearful of large gatherings of white men who come into schools, theaters, and shoot up people. But we don't isolate young white men on that issue." After the disgraceful way we treated Jewish refugees in the 30s and our own Japanese citizens during World War II, is it really necessary to say that we shouldn't react in fear and mistreat whole ethnicities?
I spend most of the time in the Houthi-controlled north of Yemen, and this is an area that's been pounded relentlessly for the past 9 months with near daily airstrikes. You can't visit a city or a town in Yemen without seeing the destruction on the ground. Everything has been hit, from homes to schools, restaurants, bridges, roads, a lot of civilian infrastructure. And with that, of course, comes a lot of the suffering. You know, all parties in this conflict have committed, are guilty of killing civilians, and the Houthi rebels and their allies are implicated in the deaths of hundreds of civilians, mostly by indiscriminate shelling, using landmines, snipers, and so forth. But according to the United Nations itself, the majority of civilians killed in this conflict have died as a result of airstrikes. A study in September found that 60% have died from these bombardments. One of the cases that I looked at was the bombing of a wedding in an area called Sanaban, which is a village just south of the capital. This was October 7th, and 3 brothers were getting married from the same village on the same night. And they when the wedding was at its peak, the brides had just arrived in a large convoy. Most of the women and children were inside the house. The men were outside in these tents erected outside. The missile smashed into the house, destroying about half of it and setting most of the rest of it on fire. Women were jumping out of the building, and 43 people were killed in the attack, including 16 children. I spoke to one of the surviving grooms, Ayman Sanabani, and he was hardly even able to fathom what had happened to him. His bride had died, 18 years old, his mother, his father, his younger sister, and his younger brother, another one of the grooms. And many people were injured in the attack, very badly burned. One of them is named Abdullah Sanabani. He's a child prodigy who won in 2012 a competition and a visit to NASA and gave a TED Talk. He now lies in a hospital in Boston. His right arm has been amputated above the elbow, and 2 of his toes have been removed. So this is just one of many cases that you see across Yemen, and it's happening while much of the world is really looking the other way. No one really is paying attention to Yemen. It doesn't get much attention in the media. And people, when you talk to them, they say, why has the world forsaken us?
And Sharif, what about this Saudi-led coalition? Who's in it, and what level of the bombing? Are we talking here on a daily basis that the bombings are occurring?
Yeah, I would say, it's very hard to get an accurate count, but certainly almost every single day bombs are raining down from across Yemen. Apart from sporadic drone strikes by the U.S., Saudi Arabia and the coalition is the only air power above Yemen. This is a coalition made up of mostly Gulf countries, led by Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates is also very heavily involved. And they have been bombing since March 26th on Yemen. What I think people also need to understand is the level of U.S. complicity in this war. So, as you mentioned at the top, Saudi Arabia is the most avid customer of U.S. weapons and has bought to the tune of $90 billion over the past 5 years, U.S. arms. What I think many people don't realize is that the United States is also providing crucial intelligence, logistics, targeting assistance, support to the Saudi coalition, provides vital aerial refueling almost every day with 2 sorties from tankers almost every day. And there's something called the Joint Combined Planning Cell, which is based in Riyadh. This was approved by President Obama, where you have U.S. military personnel meeting on a daily basis with Saudi military leadership, helping to coordinate this war. And so human rights workers that I talked to said that the United States is not just a backer of this war, but they are a party to this armed conflict. And that's what people have to understand, is that that the United States government is complicit in what is happening in Yemen.
And in essence, that Yemen has become another growth market for the American arms industry, right? Because the more bombs and more missiles that are dropped, the more that have to be sold to Saudi Arabia to replace them.
This $1.29 billion deal that was just approved by the State Department last month is to replenish these laser-guided munitions, these smart bombs, so-called smart bombs. And so
these are some of the largest U.S. military deals in history.
Right, and this is Yemen is by far the poorest country in the region, and it's being bombed by the richest.
Last week, a journalist asked State Department spokesperson John Kirby if the U.S. will support the Yemen ceasefire.
Yeah. I have a last question on Yemen. Yemen's President Hadi has asked the Saudi Arabia-led coalition to begin a 7-day ceasefire starting December 15. You are a part of the coalition. Will you support this?
We welcome the we welcome the reports of this proposal, and obviously we have to see how this plays out. But we welcome the reports of the proposal.
That was John Kirby, State Department spokesperson. Sharif.
Well, as you heard, a very tepid response, and the U.S. repeatedly says, we call on Saudi Arabia to investigate any airstrike where civilians have died, but there's been no investigations done so far. And another case that I looked at was also the bombing of a hospital, and this has happened many times in Yemen. 600 hospitals or health facilities have been forced to close from either being hit or from lack of supplies and fuel. But this was a hospital in Haidan, which is a northern town near the Saudi border. It was supported by Doctors Without Borders, the international medical organization. They regularly provided the GPS coordinates to the Saudi coalition. The MSF logo was on the roof of the building. And in late October, and Haidan is a town that's been really devastated. I mean, everything has been destroyed in the town. Schools, a water project, the main road is completely rubble. So this is the one place of sanctuary for people. And it was hit at night while doctors were sleeping in the back or sitting down for dinner. Luckily, no one was killed in the attack. But the place has been completely destroyed, and this will definitely have fatal consequences. It served over 200,000 people in a very remote area. And now doctors there who worked there said that people will die because of lack of access to healthcare.
Of course, the Saudi attack on Yemen is completely unprovoked. The international war crime of aggression. U.S. participation in that crime wasn't even authorized by Congress. There was no declaration of war. President after president shreds our Constitution into smaller and smaller pieces. That's our program for today. Be sure to look at the Latouf cartoon in the credits showing how the Saudis help the Egyptian dictator. Of course, he helps them back in the war against Yemen. What a world. I'm Stanley Heller. Thanks for watching The Struggle.